here, and Annabelle, who's also from the Office of Research Integrity at the University of Sydney. And this wouldn't have been possible without input from these 8 universities. So these are the 8 largest research-intensive universities in Australia, and in total, they're responsible for about 2/3 of research funding, competitive research funding, and research activity. So in Australia, we're in a happy and unique situation. We're quite small. There's about 41 universities. So we're able, through collaborating and cooperating, to get a good perspective of what's happening across the whole country. So thank you very much to these universities who all contributed data. So I should say as well at this point, I presented some of this data, some preliminary data, at the Australian Research Management Conference last year. Today, this is an extended data set with years added and also with some additional data added. So for those of you who are not from Australia, this is just some data to let you consider how our situation relates to yours. It's kind of old, as you can see, this is from 2011, but in Australia we have over 20 million people, so only 1/3 of the population of the UK, but we have almost the land size of the US. So there's a lot of us, a very few of us in a very big space, and we have generous investment and expenditure in R&D at a tertiary education level. So our level of investment is getting close to what the UK is, even though we only have 1/3 of the population. So why did we do this benchmarking exercise? We wanted to increase transparency about what was happening in the country. What we found is that when somebody wanted to know what was happening in research integrity, they could look in the media and they would see a small number of sensationalised cases, and they could look in the reports from the funding agencies and they would see a thin slice of what was happening. But we're actually working quite hard, continuously, with quite large case levels. So we wanted to measure that and show what was actually going on. We're also looking to build confidence in our process, because the things that feature in the media tend to have quite negative coverage, and we all knew that we were dealing with considerable workload each year with reasonably good satisfaction. Complainants and respondents were generally accepting our outcomes. So we feel like we're doing a reasonable job, and we wanted to show that. Also, to identify common issues. So things that were affecting all of our universities that potentially we could work on together to solve and to improve our environment. So in Australia, around research integrity, although we very much compete for research funding, we're very collaborative when it comes to research quality and research integrity. So I'm going to start with just some of the data. This is going to tell you the number of complaints received by these 8 universities over a 4-year period, from 2014 to 2017. So our research integrity offices received 626 complaints during this time, and we conducted almost 400 initial preliminary assessments. So the reason for that is complaints come into our research integrity offices, they don't always relate to research and they don't always sit under their code. So some of them at that point are sent off to HR or to other places and dealt with appropriately. If something sits under the research code, we conduct a preliminary assessment, which tells us the outcome of which is, could this be research misconduct if proven? If the answer to that question is yes, it goes into a formal investigation. And between us, our universities conducted 68 formal investigations over that 8-year period. So you can see there's a good deal of variation between institutes around the number of complaints that came in and the number of preliminary assessments that were conducted. And that's really about how universities are set up. What are our complaint reporting channels? Is it easier to go to research integrity, or are there reporting channels to go to HR? Are things dealt with in the faculties? So there's differences in culture and process there. This is the average number of complaints managed each year by each institution. So we each receive about 20 each year. We conduct somewhere between 10 and 15 initial inquiries, and somewhere between 0 and 4 or 5 full investigations. And all of these things are recorded in the year they came in. Quite often the investigations run over more than a year, so it has just been recognised once here. These are the categories of issues that we saw between us. So there was quite a nice even balance between plagiarism, falsification and fabrication, authorship, protocol breaches, so that's ethics, human ethics, animal ethics, IBC, Biosecurity Committee breaches. In the other, we've got not appropriately declaring and managing conflicts of interest, not storing data as they should do. All of these complaints, or many of them, were multifaceted, and this is the primary category that we've recorded here. So this shows you the yearly number of complaints by category over the 4-year period that we measured. So you'll see that there is an increase in the number of plagiarism cases from year on year. We think that that is because many of us changed our practices during the period of this survey. So for example, Sydney in 2016 started putting every high degree research thesis through plagiarism detection software. And so we saw many more that year and many more the year after. We're hoping that that's going to slowly come down now and that this isn't going to be an ongoing trend. So this is always a controversial slide when you present it internally, because there's usually a dean of medicine in the audience who's not very happy. But this was a really consistent finding across our 8 institutes. Most of the matters were in medical and medical-related fields, and that lines up quite nicely with where most of the funding goes and where a lot of the publications come. So to some extent, it's an indication of research activity. I should say also, though, that many of us have researchers in these fields that aren't employees of the institute. So the way we're set up in Australia, we have staff who are employees, and we also have affiliates who might be hospital employees or employees of other organisations but have an honorary appointment. And they can be a little bit harder to get to and train and manage than our own staff who are employed by our organisations. So what did we find after we identified and investigated all of these issues? We found between us 145 breaches of our codes over the 4-year period. We found 41 cases of research misconduct, and in 11 cases, our funding agencies took action in relation to what had happened. The data around breaches is quite varied between institutes, and that's because of our differences in culture and practice. So some of us, when a complaint is made, look at all of the behaviour around what happened. Was the person storing their records properly? Were they communicating well? Was authorship okay? Whereas other institutes focus more narrowly on just the major issue that has been raised, and that's the reason for some finding lots of breaches and some finding not so many. By the time we get down to research misconduct, we're pretty consistent. So between our institutes, the number of cases we find, it's quite consistent. And that's because we've been working to a fairly tight definition of research misconduct that was in the version of the Australian Code of Responsible Research up until this year, which requires a breach of the code, deliberation or intent, or persistent negligence, gross and persistent negligence, or harm to people, animals, or the environment. And we've all, I think, been applying that definition pretty consistently across the board. So when you see here, there's 41 cases of research misconduct, and we go back a few slides. We conducted 68 formal investigations. Whilst these don't link one-on-one, it shows that actually our preliminary assessments are doing quite a good job in identifying serious stuff. If something goes to a full investigation from a preliminary assessment, it's quite likely that there's a significant problem there. So sanctions applied by our funding agencies included banning researchers from applying for grants for periods of up to 5 years, not allowing researchers to sit on peer review committees for periods of up to 5 years, and in some cases requiring funds to be returned. So what did we do, our 8 universities, in response to the things that we found? We corrected the public record when it needed to be. And I should note there, that's when there was a breach or research misconduct or neither. If there's a problem with the public record, we corrected it. We took corrective actions. So these included failing theses, requiring HDR students to re-enroll, suspending candidature for students, putting extra measures onto staff, so they might have additional supervision, they might not be allowed to supervise students, they might have to get permission from a senior academic before they can submit a publication paper or a grant application. We terminated a small number of contracts or didn't renew employment. And there's a chunk there that received no further action. And I should note that there are a lot of people that leave during the process, especially when it gets to the pointy end, and sometimes that's why the Institute's not able to do more in relation to their conduct. So our responses were, across the 8 universities, reasonably consistent. Some people did more counselling than others. I guess counselling, we're not really sure how effective it is. A lot of us are involved in it a lot. I think one of the good things about counselling is the high degree environment in Australia is quite unionised, so there are a lot of employee rights. If somebody's engaged in misconduct and they have counselling and a written warning, and the counselling is to make sure that they understand what they have done wrong, and it happens again, then it's much more likely that their employment will be terminated. So we have to, at all stages, provide procedural fairness and make sure that the person understands what's happened, it's been discussed with a peer. And that's mostly the role of the counselling. So our data was a bit limited because of differences in culture and process between universities. Differences in training and awareness of researchers around research integrity, and the activities of our research integrity advisors. So I'll say something about our research integrity advisors here. It's a requirement in Australia that each institute has research integrity advisors. They are wise, experienced academics embedded throughout our institutes, and they're there to talk to people who might have a complaint and help them through the process. So they explain what's going to happen. They try to deal with, for example, if a student or a junior researcher has unrealistic expectations, they try to draw that out. So if research integrity advisors are active and visible and doing a good job, they may be able to help people deal with their differences and deal with their disputes at a local level without things escalating. So they help people, they coach, they don't get involved with either side of a dispute, but they might coach and say, hey, well, why don't you write to your professor and ask them this? Why don't you talk to him about this? Let's see if we can resolve it. So we think that having research integrity advisors is a really positive thing in Australia. We train them and support them and recruit them and roll them over so that we're trying to increase what's happening in the environment. The other thing that weakened our data a little bit was changes to practice during the reporting period. So those of us that started picking up a lot more plagiarism. International benchmarking. We looked into this when we did our survey. We would love to do some. We found it looked very difficult because of variations in policy. Our institutes all keep good records of the complaints we manage, but I think we'll each tell you that we had to go in manually and pull out the exact data to make sure things lined up, and it was a fair bit of work for our teams. So we haven't given up on the idea of expanding what we've done outside of Australia, but I think it will be challenging. So in conclusion, there's no evidence to suggest that the number of complaints are increasing. I think that lines up with funding, which hasn't been increasing markedly in recent years either. Everything's fairly on the level right now. The number of complaints received appears to be proportional to research effort. So within the 8 universities, those with more funding and more academic staff received more complaints. Those with less received less. It wasn't exactly lined up, but it was a very clear trend. We're quite consistent when it gets to the serious end of the spectrum and serious behaviour. Our findings of research misconduct are quite similar across institutes. And I think this also talks to the fact that we share expertise, we share investigators, one of us might call another university and say, hey, I need an experienced panel member for this matter. So within the country, our standards are quite consistent. So any questions about it?